Hey everyone, and welcome to part 2 of my generative sequencing tutorial on the Plinky. In part 1, I showed you how I like to make my generative ambient patches, and in this video, we're going to make a more rhythmic patch, a more rhythmic sequence that you could use for techno, EDM, or really any other style of music. Now, in part 1, I was using the current stable firmware version 0.b3, but as I was preparing for this video, I noticed a few features that weren't quite fully baked in the current stable firmware, so I took the plunge and downloaded the latest beta firmware version, which I will link to below in the description. I wish I would have used the beta firmware for the ambient sequencing video, but here we are. Also, some things might change a bit by the time this beta firmware is released as the new stable version, but I'm pretty sure most of the features I'm going to go through today are more or less in their final form. Now, full disclosure, I don't have very much experience making EDM or dance music. I'm terrible at putting together nice beats, so if you're like me and you don't have much experience making dance music, don't worry. All of the tips I'm going to show you today, you can use to create generative melodies for just about any other type of music. So grab your Plinky or your Plinky Plus and let's start sequencing. If you like my tutorials and jams, the best way you can support me is to visit my Bandcamp or AmpWall page. All the music I've released up until now is name your price, and any support is welcome. Now, recently on the Plinky Discord, Tony DeCaro posted, "One thing I'd love to see for Plinky would be a random pattern generator, quantized sequences at the touch of a button." I responded by saying that Plinky could indeed already do this easily, though my explanation at the time wasn't complete. So I want to start this tutorial by showing you how to do just that. Tony, if you're watching, this is for you. So I've already got this set up a little bit. I've got an 8-step sequence programmed with just our root note. Not very exciting, I know. Actually, we can even do this with just a single step. So let's set the sequence length to 1 step. If you watched part 1, you'll remember that we can patch the random pad to the scale degree parameter to get randomized transpositions within our given scale. So let's do that and attenuate the modulation until we start to get transpositions of around 7 or 8 steps, which will give us randomization of up to 1 octave. So shift down, scale degree, random pad, and I'm going to attenuate this. And there you go, a random quantized sequence. Now, of course, you can get wild with your attenuation, depending on how much transposition you want. And because this was the last parameter I touched, the encoder is still set to it, so you could even do this live on the fly. There you go. Now, if you wanted to add rests or Euclidean patterns on top of this, I would definitely recommend setting the pattern to at least 8 steps so that the sequencer has something to work with. And there you have it, random quantized sequences with the Plinky. Just save this to one of your presets and you're ready to go with random sequences whenever you need them. Now, as much as I love random sequences, I think you can get a much more musical result by starting with an intentionally programmed sequence. So let's use the pattern from the basic sequencing tutorial in part 1, which I really liked. And we're going to use that as the foundation for everything else we do today. And before we start turning this into a more generative melody, I want to show you some tips for how you can get some variation out of this without changing any notes at all. In the first part of this tutorial, I showed you how to change the length of your pattern using the transport pads. What I didn't show you is that you can change the length of your pattern while the sequence is playing. Let's try that. Yeah, so This example is a little bit silly. I've got 64 pattern steps to use, and what I just played could easily just be programmed into the sequencer without needing to tweak the pattern length on the fly. But I still think this is a useful technique. You could use the 8-step pattern for a while and then lengthen it later to add variation to your sequence or to your set. Now, one thing I haven't talked about yet in this series is the other transport pad here, the left arrow. Up until now, I've only used this to navigate around the sequence or to check and correct the steps I've programmed. But if you press and hold that pad, it will allow you to set the starting point for your sequence. Now, in the current stable version 0.b3 firmware, this only sets the starting point for the first loop of your sequence. When the sequence reaches the final step, it will still loop all the way back around to step 1. But in the beta firmware, this has been fixed. So by pressing and holding the left transport pad, you can indeed set a fixed starting point for your sequence. And you can see through the lights here, hopefully, I've got an 8-step sequence that's going to start here, there, here, wherever you like. And of course, if your sequence is longer, you can get longer sequences that will move around. So you could use the first 16 steps for one part of your set, and then steps 17 through 32 for a different part of your set, just like this. Your presets will also store the pattern length and starting points, so you could use different parts of the same sequence for different presets. One thing that's missing from this sequence is rests or empty steps. Now, it's easy to forget to add rests into your music, but I think the rests are just as important as the notes themselves. So before we start changing any of the notes, let's look at some interesting ways to add rests into your sequence. In the part 1 video, I already showed you how to use the chance pad to add some random rests to your sequence. So here it is again. I'm going to use the chance pad and just set the percent to about 75. And that means around 1 in every 4 notes won't trigger and will be a rest. Just as a side note, this doesn't work properly in the current stable firmware version 0.b3. Instead of turning steps into rests, it adds rests in between the steps, which isn't what we want. And a second side note, in order to get really random rests, you want to set the Euclidean length to random, which is all the way to the left. So let's hear that. Now, you can, of course, adjust this to your taste for more or less density. You could even tie an LFO to this setting and get density that slowly changes over time. Another way to add rests is using the Euclidean length pad. Now, I will mention again, this is one of the features that's not quite fully baked in version 0.b3, but in the new beta firmware I'm using, this works great. So unlike the randomly skipped steps, the Euclidean length setting will create rests in a more predictable pattern. Now, if you're new to Euclidean patterns, I won't go into detail about them here, but there are a bunch of great videos on YouTube explaining how this works. So I'm going to set the Euclidean length to 5. And this will create a 5-step trigger pattern within my 8-step sequence. Now, if you start your sequence like this, it actually doesn't change anything at all. In order to hear anything change, you need to go back into the chance settings and set that to something less than 100. So I've got it here at about 90. And you can hear there are 4 steps that get triggered and 1 step of rest. And depending on the chance setting, you're going to get different patterns of rests. This is already so cool. Now, because our 5-step Euclidean trigger pattern doesn't divide evenly into our 8-step sequence, you get a phase shift as the pattern progresses. So the trigger pattern always stays the same, but different notes are getting triggered on each loop. 5 times 8 is 40, so we've effectively turned our 8-step sequence into a 40-step sequence just using the Euclidean length. You know what? I'm going to add some delay to this just for fun. The timed delay, I think, is also new in this beta firmware version. Yeah, this is already so much fun. We've got those delayed notes filling in the rests in time. And then setting that Euclidean length to random, combined with the chance, you'll get a less predictable pattern. But I really like taking an odd number like that and dividing it into the even sequence, or multiplying it by that even numbered sequence. All right, this is too much fun. I think I have to stop before I get carried away. All right, so this is a fun little 8-step sequence, but I think it could use some pitch variation. Just like in the previous patch where we created a totally random pattern, we're going to start by using the random pad, but this time I want to patch it to the octave parameter. So let's start the sequence. And I'm just going to keep attenuating until I start hearing some octave jumps. Yeah. The higher you go with the attenuation, the more likely it will be that octave jumps will occur, and at some point double octaves will also come into play. Now, if you don't want the octave to go up, you can set this to negative values, which will give you octave jumps downward. I have to say, I think it's just amazing how much an octave jump can change the sequence, even though it's still just the same notes. All right, just as we did in the ambient patch, let's also patch the random modulation to the scale degree. Again, I'm going to start attenuating this until I see jumps of around 4 or 5 steps, which you can see here on the screen. I love that on this new beta firmware. The screen is just so much more clear and you get so much more information. Now, you could go much further with this, but I like to keep it subtle because then the basic shape of our sequence still remains more or less intact and it keeps some musical cohesion. Otherwise, it's just a series of totally random notes. In fact, I think this is combined with the octave a little bit too much. Now, one thing I also think is fun is to patch the degree to a knob. Let's do knob B in this case. And then just at the twist of a knob, you've got a bass line, patching the degree parameter to knob B to get some wild play with the degree here with the knob. I think it's fun. So as far as pitch modulation goes, I think I'm pretty happy with this. Just remember that you don't have to use all of the scale degree and octave modulation all at once. If I was performing this patch live, which I'm going to do at the end of this video, I would probably start with the basic sequence and then slowly add the scale degree and octave modulation as the set progresses. So now let's work on some ways to modulate the sound to make this sequence even more interesting. Again, I'm going to use this random pad to modulate a few things, but first let's set our chance back to something less than 100% so we get our rests back. My Euclidean length is still set to 5. So right now the sound is pretty much the same for every single note. So I'm going to patch distortion to our random pad so we get some occasional accents and that not every single note is the same sound or the same volume. And I also want to patch the release stage to the random pad so we get some different note lengths and they're not all the same. This is a little bit too much. You know what? I'm going to set the base value of our release stage a little bit lower just so we get some more variation. Let's give it even more. Yeah, there we go. Now, you don't always have to use the random pad for modulation. It's just a really easy go-to spot to get some variation. You can also use your LFOs, which we haven't even touched yet. So let's grab an LFO and patch it to the filter, which is the sensitivity pad here. In fact, I'm going to first patch the sensitivity to knob A. Yeah, so we get some dynamic control over it here with the knob. That already sounds really nice. And you know what? I also really liked the delay from before, so let's add that back in. Beautiful. Okay, but we were actually patching sensitivity to an LFO. Let's take LFO X. Let's give it just a little bit of modulation here. And we're going to set the shape of LFO X to smooth random. We're going to set the rate also to something nice and slow. I like that it shows it in milliseconds and seconds here. Actually, if you go counterclockwise with the knob, you get, let's get there, clocked LFOs, which is great. But for now, let's just go with a slow, unclocked LFO. And before we hear anything, we need to add some depth to that modulation. So now the filter will change a little bit, even without moving the knob. That's some pretty slow modulation, so it might be a bit hard to hear at first. Okay, now just like for the ambient patch, let's patch the wave shape to another LFO, in this case LFO Y. We've got to give that some modulation. Oops, it's maybe a bit too much. And again, we're going to set this to random smooth. Whoops, that's our LFO X. We're going to set the shape of LFO Y to smooth random. We're going to set the rate to something nice and slow again. Let's do around 5 seconds. And of course, this also needs some depth. Now, one thing to keep in mind that I didn't mention in the ambient video is in order to get modulation to the shape, that base value needs to be set to something other than 0. Otherwise, it won't do anything. So you need either +1. There we go. And that will modulate the position of the wavetable. And if you go into negative numbers counterclockwise, then it's modulating the pulse width. But you can't modulate through 0. But I think we're going to stick with wavetable modulation. So let's just go up a little bit here so it's got some space to go. Let's hear that. Yeah, beautiful. Now, there are some other modulation points you can use here, which I haven't talked about. There's noise, there's resonance, there's even a second envelope, which you can attach to something else. Again, have fun with this. This is the fun part, is finding all these patch points to find some great modulation for your patch. All right, I think our patch is ready. Though, to be honest, all of this modulation is a little bit too much for my taste. Just like with the scale degree modulation, you don't have to do all of this all at once. I just did it now for demonstration purposes. I think it's better to dole these modulations out slowly over time to really get the most out of each patch point and also just have somewhere to go with the piece. I'll close this video by jamming with this patch and trying to add some beats. So thanks for watching and happy plinking.